inside look at California politics in the state legislature. I'm your host, Assemblyman Josh Hoover, and excited to be joined today by Matt Diaz, who is the CEO and president of the California Forestry Association. Welcome to the podcast, Matt.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah, thanks for being with us today. So just a little quick background on CFA, and then I'll let you kind of dive more into it. But from a very surface level, the California Forestry Association, or CalForest, is the preeminent trade association for the state's forestry sector. Their members are committed to ensuring California has an adequate and sustainable supply of affordable forest products while maintaining and enhancing wildlife habitat, water resources, air quality, and rural economies. Really nothing going on there, right? Just very seems like a real easy job.
We do have a lot going on, without a doubt. I could give a quick background on myself.
Yeah, I was going to start with that. So let's tell us a little bit about you and your background and how you kind of came to this position.
So I have been in forestry now for 25 years. I've served in the public sector as well as the private sector. I'm a graduate of Humboldt State University, now Cal Poly Humboldt. Graduated in 99, and for the first about 12 or 13 years of my career, I worked in the woods. I'm a registered professional forester, doing environmental compliance, working with private landowners across the state, in Humboldt County and Santa Cruz County. I developed a zeal for regulation policy, if you will, as a representative of forestry in the Central Coast, Santa Cruz area, and ultimately got appointed to run the licensing program for foresters in the state with the State Board of Forestry and Fire Protection, and migrated on to be the executive officer. I was with that board for just over 12 years, I believe. And now I've been with CalForest for about 3. CalForest, as you stated, is a trade association, and it's true to its nature. And we do represent the forest products sector. And with that comes about 4 million acres in the state are owned and managed by our members. And our members are a bit diverse, I suppose, in terms that some of them are landowners, resource managers. They own and manage timberland. Some of them own and manage facilities. And then some of them are a little more vertically integrated, where they own lands that are supporting facilities that they also run, if you will. So generally speaking, our members are in the state, some benchmarks that people are familiar with. On the east side, Yosemite, north of the Oregon border, and then on the coastal side from the Oregon border south to Santa Cruz, south of the bay. So all things policy related to forest practice, forestry in general, that is the space in which we live and operate.
That's awesome. So, I mean, what do you guys see? And obviously you're coming at this from a certain perspective, but I know we talk a lot in California, and there's a lot of obviously bills and policy and discussions, stuff from the governor, stuff from the legislature around how we need to better take care of our forests, and obviously about some of the devastating fires that we've been seeing over these last few years. I know we hear a lot too from our firefighters as well, and the communities that have been really impacted by these fires. What do you see as some of the biggest challenges facing your industry and also just forest management as a whole in California?
Well, I think it's fair to say right off the get-go, you made a comment there in terms of coming from a certain perspective, and that's certainly the case. I mean, I am representing the forest product sector, and I'm not everybody that I work with knows that, right?
Yeah.
But beyond that, I think it's really important to understand that there was a time and place when I was a younger man, and even before I was in the practice of forestry, that the management of forest was extraordinarily divisive. There was concern over nearly all projects that were happening, or many of them, I should say, concern about the ownership patterns. But in terms of the biggest issues that we're facing, the crisis that we're facing on the highest level is wildfire in the state. And so as we start looking at the solutions in that space of wildfire, and there's other issues we'll talk about as well, but when we start looking at solutions legislatively, administratively, building partnerships, I do believe that we're in a time and place where there's kind of a renaissance of forestry to a certain extent, where the common minds, if you will, are much more centered on solution building rather than divisive, if you will. So there's a lot. My observation is that my organization, CalForest, spends a lot of time talking with some of the conservation partners about
Hmm.
how are we going to address these issues into the
Yeah.
future, talking to our state partners, Cal Fire, our legislative partners, and finding that we have a lot more intersection rather than
Yeah.
device perspectives, if you will, divisive perspective. So I think that's a healthy
Yeah.
environment that we're entering into.
Yeah. No, that's
Or
actually really interesting.
yeah, so I mean, wildfire, we could talk about the wildfire crisis, and I encourage us to do that. But some of the other issues I think that are out there, and some of them tear off wildfire, but we have workforce problems. This is not unique to the
Yeah.
forest product sector. We have workforce issues across all sectors,
Yeah.
private, NGO, government, everybody's faced with that crisis to a certain extent. Um, we have an issue that we'll talk about hopefully, which is related to forest waste utilization, which I think is really important and critical that we need to tackle that now
Yeah.
rather than later. We've been trying, we haven't done a great job, so we can talk about that a little bit. Um, I don't really want to get into the permitting because for a venue like this,
Yeah.
a conversational venue gets really intricate, if you will.
Yeah. Sure.
So I don't think we need
Yeah.
to dig into that, but there are some pieces there. But I think one of the biggest pieces of the puzzle that people don't understand about forestry in California is that we are a state of approximately 104 million acres. When we talk about forestry, the
Yeah.
context is always acres. So California is 104 million acres. Of that, 33 million of it is considered forest land. So we're talking about these problems, that the problems that we're going to be speaking about in terms of changing climates or biomass markets or work for whatever they may be. We're talking about problems that are pervasive across a third of the state in terms of
Well,
acreage, if you
yeah.
will. Within that third of the state, or 33 million acres of forests, over half of it is in federal management. So this is the federal partners managing land on behalf of the people of our state
Yeah.
and on a greater level, our nation. But they have control of over half of the forest land in California.
Wow.
So there's that issue of jurisdiction, if you will, at times that becomes a barrier as well. So that's not like a permitting need, but it's a
Right.
jurisdictional need. And the way that we operate at the federal level versus the way that we operate at the state level versus the way we operate at a private level or
Hmm.
an NGO level, it's all very different at times. And so that makes it hard to come together with solutions because the solutions aren't as cut and dry as we can do it better this way because you have to turn the dials, if you will, in
Yeah.
multiple locations to make the outcomes as bright as we want them to be, if that makes sense. So again, California is a unique state in that we have a tremendous amount of federally managed lands, and that is uh, that is a very bright issue when it comes to forest lands in
Hmm.
California.
So let's stay on that for a second. So the federal issues. So I think that's actually always an important thing to point out because in some ways the state and the legislature and the governor, like we can only do so much about the territory that we cover, right? So about half of the forest land is federally owned. What is the difference in how the feds manage the forest versus the state? And what are some of the biggest problems with kind of that having these two different governments managing these separate areas?
Yeah, so I would suggest that. So first of all, um, our legislature, your legislature,
Yeah.
in the past several years has done a very good job, in my opinion, in investing in fuel hazard reduction work, investing in forest health, resiliency, wildfire suppression, if you will. Um, and some of those investments are actually being driven towards federal landscapes,
Okay.
right? And so even though as a state body, as a rulemaking body, if you will, the legislature and even our administration don't have the quote unquote authority to drive specific outcomes in terms of the way that um, those lands are managed, we do have the vision within the state to invest. And when the
Mm.
state isn't investing, there is some points of leverage that could be potentially pursued as well, right?
Yeah.
So there's that angle of it, I suppose, to a certain
Okay.
extent. Um, Without getting into an abundant amount of detail about all the objectives and goals, every single entity out there could be tribal, could be industrial, could be NGO related, could be federal. They all operate under certain parameters and missions, right? And The goal is to really find the center ground between all those missions, and that's the space that we would need to operate in.
Yeah.
The federal partners, the parks are managed for parks.
Hmm.
Um, the Forest Service is operating under a mission where they have objectives as it relates to recreation. They have objectives as it relates to research and so on and so forth. But one of their primary objectives is also to be conducting forest management activities
Right.
for the economic benefit to a certain extent, but also for the conservation benefit. And that's the space that I think that we are really looking to work in to try to drive outcomes, because we are trying to help the Forest Service get to where they need to be to a certain extent. And there are good people within that agency. But at times it's unfortunate that um, the mired bureaucracy that's been thrust upon them thwarts their ability to
Yeah.
move rapidly. So,
I think we can say that about a lot of different things throughout the state too, in terms of bureaucracy and kind of how slow the government tends to move as well. And then once you get up to the federal government, obviously it's even bigger, right?
it is
It's a
larger.
much larger bureaucracy.
Yeah,
And it's a lot. It's a very big ship to really steer, I'm sure.
right.
You said something earlier too that I wanted to get back to as well, on this shift that's taken place where things used to be really divisive, and now things have really, there seems to be more common ground growing in terms of how industry and maybe conservationists, conservation groups can work together. What do you think like caused that shift? Is some of that kind of this concern for example, the wildfires that we've been seeing, that that's really problematic for our environment, right? The emissions that get put off, obviously, by a very large California fire is very substantial. Obviously, the wildlife that is impacted by those fires as well. I mean, is there this kind of realization that we can't just leave the forests alone, and we actually have to be responsible in managing them? Otherwise, all of these kind of negative impacts are going to happen.
Right. So, a couple different things that I've observed over my career, and even reflecting on a generation or two before mine, is that um, generally speaking, all the members of Cal Forests, generally speaking, there's very few outliers. These are all family owned businesses. Many of these families have been in California for literally upwards of uh, a century in some cases, beyond that. So we have a different, we're not held to the quote unquote corporate standard, if you will,
Mm,
in some cases, right? So I think there's a recognition of that to a certain extent.
yeah.
I also think that along with that comes different management regimes and different goals and objectives. That has been more widely recognized. But beyond all of that, when we are looking at the wildfire crisis in California and we are losing upwards of 1 million to 2 million acres of year of forests, we only have so many, even though a third of our state is covered in forest
Right.
lands, it is not so pervasive that we can just continue to let the fire regimes burn at the state that they are and expect that in a decade we're going to have much in the way of forest lands remaining, if you will.
Interesting.
So, from my perspective, and so when you start thinking about that, when everybody starts thinking about that collectively, you start thinking about the impacts to air sheds. And when I was younger, wildfire was not even an issue in Sacramento or the Bay Area
Sure.
or the LA basin. But now, when we have these huge conflagrations, we have these population centers now sitting in air sheds that are imperiled by wildfire smoke for weeks and weeks and weeks on end.
Yep.
So, our public trust resources that we have, our water, our air, our wildlife, they're all being impacted at a rate of change that is unparalleled. And so that really drives that divisive nature
Hmm.
that we experienced at one time to be more of a collaborative nature, which we enjoy now. And so that's
Yeah.
where I see it,
That's an
anyways.
interesting point. I mean, it really is true. And like, when we hear about wildfires, we obviously hear about the people immediately impacted, maybe nearby the wildfire itself. We hear about the emissions that get put off by burning of that carbon, for example. But we don't always talk about those secondary effects. I mean, my district, for example, doesn't have a lot of wildfire issues directly, but there have been days that we have canceled school because the air
Right.
quality from a wildfire up north is impacting our district, right, or our air. And
Yeah.
so there certainly are like a trickle down effect of issues for sure that impact a lot of different people.
And it goes beyond that even. I mean, the empirical record is growing on a daily basis where there's a lot of research being conducted at very well recognized institutions, Stanford's
Yeah.
and Berkeley's. And I mean, these very, very well respected institutions. And the data is clear.
Yeah.
Like the smoke impacts to the human population in the state is going to drive up costs of healthcare into the future.
Mm.
It's not a matter of like if, it's a matter of when, if at this point. So in your district, Member Hoover, you can expect that if we continue to have airshed impacts as dramatic as they have been over the last decade, that's going to affect your district in some form or fashion. And the same holds true with many members of our legislature.
Yeah.
And the same holds true for our water resources. I mean, you know that water is as large an issue as any issue.
Yeah.
In public policy. I mean, we have some don't get me wrong, it's as large as any other. Let's put it that way. It appears to me anyhow. And where does the water come from in our state? Well, the greatest majority of our water is generated through storage and filtration capacity of upland forest, headwater forest, if you will. So if we have healthy, resilient forests, we have higher quality and quantity of water. And that water is being transferred in many cases to our ag fields and domestic users in the southern part of the state. So our Northern California forests are a critical economic and ecological driver for the South as well, right? And so those are the kind of issues that people are recognizing now. And so that's why we enjoy, I shouldn't say enjoy, but that's why we are experiencing a higher level of collaboration with all of our partners.
Because people understand, what that everything is connected.
Yeah, everything's connected. Right? Yeah.
And we didn't even bring up, by the way, the fire insurance issue, which I'm not going to ask you to dive into, right?
Yeah.
But I mean, that's not what this podcast is about. But I mean, hearing from, and again, not as many folks in my district struggling with this, but hearing about the challenges in some other surrounding counties of Placer, El Dorado on, non-renewals, and not even non-renewals, but just not even be able to get a single company to insure you, ending up on the FAIR plan. All of these are impacts from, in some ways, indirectly from forest management as well.
They are. And, we talked about it very briefly earlier, but workforce, right? So I think about the employment opportunities of which the forest product sector is a major driver of rural health, if you will, economically speaking.
Yeah.
And if you have a company that has 200 or 300 employees that are living in locations like Quincy or Redding or Weaverville or Susanville or whatever it may be, Eureka, Fort Bragg, well, the cost of insurance is skyrocketing, which makes it harder to retain employees. And so the workforce issue, we have a low number of persons that want to get into this industry or are even aware that we exist, number one. Yeah. But then when you start compounding that with issues like housing and insurance costs, that makes the workforce issue that much more challenging to try to navigate. And so there's the practical effect of this insurance problem in rural communities beyond just like, I can't afford to live here. It's like, I can't afford to live here and the employers can't afford to lose them, if you will. So it cuts both ways. That's just one angle of a very, very big issue that is presiding over California right now with respect to insurance.
That's a great point too. Definitely one that we got to consider. So real quickly, a little bit of a sidestep, and then I want to talk more about biomass because I do think that, I have some thoughts on that too from some things I actually did this week that were kind of fun. But just in terms of, have you seen? Let's dive in a little bit, if you can, to the history of kind of forest management, and what are some of the changes that you have seen from today till have things gotten worse? I guess would be the number one question that you have seen in terms of forests, and what are some of the drivers of that? And then just like maybe in a very simple way, explain to the listeners what a resilient forest would look like. What do we actually have to do to make that happen, right? Like, obviously we need to fund projects, but what does that actually mean? What does suppression look like? And what is the work that actually has to be done?
Okay, so let's talk just a really brief overview of history.
Yeah.
So California has the most, I would not even say some of, the most arduous regulatory scheme as it relates to forest management
Mm,
in the nation and arguably the globe. I've never seen anywhere else outside of even our nation that has restrictions as deep as ours.
mm,
So when you think about that, that whole regulatory scheme was um, we operate what's under the forest practice rules. If you're a private landowner in California, you operate under the forest practice rules.
yeah,
And those rules demand protection of all the public trust resources that we have just previously talked about. That you
yeah,
have to have water course protection, protection for species that may or may not be present, scoping and surveys to make sure absence and presence surveys for owls or raptors or amphibians, that kind of thing. So they demand that level of protection. They talk about winter operations and when and how you can operate during the winter, so you're not um, discharging erosion. Essentially, is what it comes down to. Impact. So it's all about soil protection, water protection, protection of visual impacts, these kind of things. It's very very robust.
mm,
Let's just say that. And then you ask if things have gotten worse. And um, I would suggest that things have not gotten worse at all, that they've gotten much better.
mm,
Because if you look at the opportunities that are available to landowners right now in terms of engagement with the federal partners and in getting habitat conservation plans that are demanding um, individual species, like a group of 17, 18, 19 species that may be a threat, demanding that you are not only documenting, but you're restoring populations. And so all these moving parts out there in the regulatory world, if you will, federal and state, are demanding better outcomes. And those better outcomes can be seen across the landscape for sure.
mm,
Now, I would suggest that that's mostly applicable to small landowners, non-industrial landowners, and industrial landowners. And when we get into the federal landscape, at times we do have some pretty significant challenges still. We have a very large amount of acres that were, I shouldn't use the word moratorium, but in the early 90s, the management of those acres were essentially turned away from for the
mm,
most part in a significant way. And as a result of that, we have extraordinarily dense forests, meaning that we have way too many stems an acre, too many trees an acre, and too thick understory. The
mm,
understory brush layers are just too dense. So what does that result in? We have fire suppression, we have lack of management, and we now have forests that are just overly dense across much of
got it.
California. What occurs? Well, the data is clear.
Yeah,
It occurs in million acre fires, the August complex from a couple years ago, the Dixie fire burning from the west side of the Sierra Nevadas all the way over to the east side of the Sierra Nevadas, blanketed for the first time in California's modern history, a fire burning over the entire Sierra Nevadas in one fell swoop. We have the Park Fire from this year, 430,000 acres. We have the Rim Fire, 269,000 acres, on and on and on and on. And so, in terms of it being worse, the fire regime is much worse, and which is why we all need to center on devising solutions to address that problem in its whole. Forests are not static. This is
yeah,
what
yeah,
you take your children camping. I take my children
yeah,
camping. They don't look at the forest the same way that I do. They show up and it's like almost like a museum setting or something. We're at a campground and this is going to be like
yeah,
this all the time. Extraordinarily um, dynamic habitats. And so we just need to understand that what you see now is not going to be there later, and it was not there 15 years ago, right?
right.
These are static systems that are constantly growing. Nature is a driver of production of water, production of sand, production of rock,
Yeah,
and so on and so forth. And it's also production of vegetation. And so that's just that we just need to like understand that as a state and as a person living in this state that is now being essentially forced or learning to live with wildfire.
yeah,
So
yeah. That's really interesting, and It's amazing too when you put it in that context of we have 33 million acres, you said, of forest,
Hmm.
and you can actually have a 1 million acre fire essentially, which is pretty astounding to think about the actual size of that.
It's shocking. I mean,
It's
I wish I could get more of your colleagues up on these tours and
yeah.
take folks out to a single peak in the middle of the Dixie Fire.
Mm,
And I will, the shocking, like the pure shock that people see when you stand on a mountaintop and can look in every single direction
mm,
and see hardly any green trees remaining.
wow.
I mean, and then communities that are devastated that are
Yeah.
in the periphery of these and these fires or within these fires. I mean, it is it is a thing to behold that is nothing short of just it's just shocking. I don't know how else to put it. And people don't experience that. Like people from the LA basin, they don't
Yeah.
have the opportunity to experience that. The Bay Area, they don't have the opportunity to experience that. Us people that live and breathe and essentially work on behalf of our state's forest see that kind of activity, see that
Yeah.
devastation, and you live with it for years. You can't walk away from it and not live with it for years. So it's easy to talk numbers,
Mhm.
but until you're actually immersed in an environment that's been afflicted by some kind of devastating fire of that nature,
Yeah.
you can't even really comprehend it well. The news doesn't capture it well.
Yeah.
Um, you just have to experience it for yourself. I don't know how else to say it other than that.
I think it's a great point, and to be honest with you, and you don't need to comment on this, but I would say that we have a very diverse state, right? We have a lot of different areas in our state. That's one of the things I love about California. But when you're sitting in this building with 80 of your colleagues, right, legislating on topics, from wildfires to education to a number of other things, we have to acknowledge and admit that we are not experts on everything, right?
Right.
And it's really important and incumbent upon us to get out there and like learn about things that aren't familiar to our districts, right?
Right.
Like my district doesn't have a lot of agriculture, right? But I was out in one of my colleagues' districts this week, checking out a bunch of farming community, operations and processing plants, and I actually sat in a rice harvester for about an hour, and it was a really awesome experience, and it
Yeah.
really opened my eyes to this is the work that's being done in the real world, right? And too often we get into that building and start voting on things and we don't really understand the real world impacts of some of those policies, right? And
Yeah.
so I love that. Actually, I love the idea of getting more people to the mountaintop, that point at the Dixie Fire, and letting them see that. I had an opportunity to meet with a family that lost their home in Paradise,
Uh,
and I actually went to their home. That's no longer there, but it's literally just a chimney, right? I mean, it's
yeah.
it's amazing to just drive through Paradise after that devastation and see obviously all the cars that are burned, but you just see like chimneys like throughout and nothing else.
Yeah.
And it is just um it's really hard to like comprehend almost
It
to your
really
point,
is.
put into words.
And you go up there now and they're still under a reconstruction effort.
Oh yeah.
Same holds true in Santa Cruz Mountains. I mean,
Yeah.
Santa Cruz Mountains had experienced significant fire, if you will, since 1948. And all of a sudden 2009 rolls around and we have a Lockheed incident, which fortunately did not burn any homes, but it was a 9,500 acre fire in Santa Cruz. I was working in Santa Cruz at the
Wow.
time. And we were shocked then. And then only a
Mm.
matter of 10 years later, 90,000 acres CZU complex comes back, burns that entire 9,000 acres, along with the surrounding 80,000 acres, and takes out 1,600 homes and businesses. And so if you go to these communities that are affected by that devastation, they are in a rebuilding phase for a decade, maybe
Mm.
more. And the campfire in 2018 in Paradise, terribly, terribly shocking and unfortunate event. But that community is still grasping with
Yeah.
rebuilding. And so, what is the cost of that rebuilding? What are we investing in that rebuilding? What is the cost of rebuilding the outskirts of Santa Rosa?
Yeah.
What's the
Uh,
cost of rebuilding the outskirts of Weed and the smaller communities, Greenville, and that have been? I mean, the amount of time and energy going into that is unbelievable. So
Yep.
You take all that into consideration, along with the cost of fire suppression, which I'm a big, big supporter of suppression, but start thinking about ways to ameliorate fire, like the rate of spread and the
Hmm.
devastation associated with these fires, so you can start bringing those costs down. So the investment now, in
Yeah.
my opinion, is worthwhile when you look at the balance of what we are spending and the turmoil and strife that families are going through. It
Yeah.
makes sense to me.
Yeah.
So that
Worthwhile investments for sure.
worthwhile investments. I think there's more that we could invest in potentially.
Yeah, that's a good point. So quickly shifting gears, and I think that topic obviously is important to a lot of people, but I know biomass, right, is another topic that you have a lot of experience in, and so can you just like maybe start, and then we can dive into like why this is important, but like what is biomass first of
Yeah,
all,
yeah.
because I think a lot of people don't know the role that it can play in the energy sector, and essentially just a breakdown of what it is, and then why you think it's important.
Okay, so I'm extraordinarily passionate about this because I think it is one of the, in my opinion, I think that is one of the foundational pieces that we really need to grapple with in the state. So what is it? So biomass is essentially wood waste. Okay, and it's not just a forest derived problem. That's where I sit. That's why I think
Sure.
we need to grapple with it dramatically, in a dramatic fashion for sure. But ag, I'm assuming when you were with the rice farmers last week,
Yeah,
that there was discussion about what to do with the waste of rice
absolutely.
husks.
Yeah, it was actually interesting. Rice husks, and then I was toured a walnut facility, right? Where they're actually, shelling the walnuts and then shipping the walnuts, but then they have all this, the shells,
Right,
right? Like that, and they have a lot of additional material, right? And
right.
so what do you do with all that
So
stuff?
what do you do? So it's kind of like a residuals, if you will. It's like a
Yeah,
residual piece. So let's just think about owning a 60-acre parcel. You and I own a
yeah,
60-acre parcel together. And we are fortunate enough to engage in a process to get a grant for fuel hazard reduction work. We're going to go through, we're going to thin our forest, and we're going to reduce the understory. We're going to masticate.
okay,
We're going to remove a number of trees, if you will, small diameter in many instances, maybe a couple larger diameter. So the larger diameter trees, to attain the right spacing, are going to go to a sawmill if one's available.
okay,
The smaller diameter trees, the brush, the tops, the limbs, the branches,
yeah,
there's nowhere to put them.
mm,
And so, what do you do with that? Very similar to the question that the walnut
yeah,
farmer would ask you. What do you do with that?
yeah,
In our world, what you do with it is you end up piling it, and you either burn it, or you leave it. And in many cases, people that are foresters like myself, or folks that are doing harvesting activities or landowners, they do not want to burn that material because if a fire escapes, the
yeah.
liability
It's very
associated with
risky.
that is very risky. So in many cases, it is stored on the landscape. So you drive by a pile of woody material on the landscape, and it looks just like a pile of woody material. But what people aren't drawing the next step to is that's decaying. And the short-term pollutants that are coming out of that, primarily methane, are
Yeah,
some of the worst pollutants for GHGs in the spectrum of
right,
our CO2 issues, our atmospheric issues, right? So you either open burn it and you release a bunch of
right.
particulates in an uncontrolled state, or you store it on the landscape and it's decomposing over time and slowly emitting. And so we need to, and on top of all that, we've got grant dollars, and we conducted a project, and now we've got fuel stored in ginormous piles on our landscape because there's nowhere to put it, or we're spreading it across the landscape to let it decay slowly over time.
Mm,
The project that you and I did certainly changed fire behavior. We reduced the density of the forest. We reduced the understory. We've got material moved out and stored in a different manner. But could we have done it better? We certainly could have done it better if we could have gotten that material off and into some kind of facility. And there's some level of market driver to help us do that.
yep,
If we owned 100 acres and we actually applied for a grant, but it only covered 60 acres. We were only able to obtain grant funding, let's say, for 60 acres of treatment, or we did a commercial type of treatment along with a non-commercial treatment, and all of that only allowed us to treat 60 acres of it. Well, if we had an economic driver to get the biomass, the wood waste off, we might have been able to treat that whole 100 acres. So your money, your public investment and the private investment goes further. So we're getting more acres treated, and we're getting them treated in a way that's driving better resiliency in the long term.
So you're essentially, what it would do is it would essentially create a demand for what we need to get rid of anyway, which is, obviously managing our forests responsibly and things like that. But it would create a demand for what's coming out of that.
That's right.
And then it would, in some ways, create its own economy.
That's right. And a microeconomy at that. Like, let's be clear. Transportation of wood waste, transportation of ag waste to a facility that's got some kind of co-benefit associated with it, electricity, biochar, whatever it may be, hydrogen at times. Folks are looking at aviation fuel, all these different opportunities. Does not appear to be a big dollar industry, but in terms of the impact in the forestry landscape, tremendous impact, right? Yeah. So we do need market drivers in California. When I was a younger man, we had them. To a certain extent, and we've lost many of them, and so we need to bring that back.
What were those? What you're referring to?
So we have
more industries.
So in Northern California, we have several facilities that some are still operational and some are idle. But the tried and true technology that exists in California, and we are blessed to have what we have, but we certainly could open up these idle facilities, is wood waste to combustion in a controlled environment to reduce particulate matter, heating water turning to steam turning turbine creating electricity, and providing electricity back to the grid. And we do have those facilities in California. There's a handful of them, but over the course of time, the policies in the state and the vision of many of the leaders in the past have essentially resulted in several of them shutting down. And the reason why they're shutting down is because we're trying to innovate new technologies that would be focused on that hydrogen output or those biochar outputs or whatever other co-benefit there may be, sustainable aviation fuel. But we are decades away from having that happen. We've been trying to do that for a decade or more, 20 years. We haven't been successful. We are looking, and I am completely supportive of the idea of allowing new technologies to help us with our waste, if you will, our residual, our biomass, but we can't turn a blind eye to what we have and what we had. So we really need to get all those facilities in Northern California up and running to the highest level possible. And while we're recognizing that we are bridging to something bigger and better, we got so much material out there that we could open up 25, 50 of these facilities, and we're still not going to treat the material that's coming off the landscape in many cases, particularly when you're looking at ag and forest waste cumulatively.
That's incredible.
So it's a really big problem. It's a huge problem, in fact. And so that education piece, going to the mountaintop, if you will, that is a piece that I believe that many of your colleagues could benefit from, to understand what we talk about as a forest community in the space of residual utilization.
So what would it take? What would it take for, to obviously encourage more of this? And I guess we'll make it a two-parter. What are some of the legislative work that you've been doing on the policy side to really help, obviously, encourage more biomass, but also, just more resiliency and things like that?
Well, in the space of biomass, I will tell you it's a very, very difficult, nut to crack. Okay. What do we do to encourage it? I think that when we think about the innovation side, like the next generation, if you will, I think that we do need to really take a close look at the structure of our laws and start trying to allow investments in these to occur without there being an extraordinarily and draconian regulatory scheme that they're trying to navigate through locals and state and CEQA and all the factors that lie into it. So I mean, it's a known quantity that there's been several folks in California that they recognize, like they can do, they
Yeah.
can get data as it relates to feedstock. The feedstock's abundant. The environment is tough to invest in.
Yeah.
And so we need to talk to, and so there's folks out there that have tried to invest in
Yeah.
California and are now in the Southeast.
Interesting.
And so that's a problem like
Yeah.
that. So we
Because
had
they're not
people, they're
taking our
interested.
waste out there. They're going and taking care of their waste,
That's
right?
right. And so you take a look at that. This is probably not the right venue to start talking about all the different mechanisms and levers that
Sure.
you could pull and dials you could turn. But as
Sure.
a general thought, um, just taking a look and understanding that we need to turn ourselves into an incubator of this
Yeah.
industry rather than a detractor, if
Sure.
you will. And then on the other side, that's the bridge. That's next generation. Our current facilities, there are programs in the state that address these facilities, and they have cap rates on them. And we need to
Mm.
turn those dials. We need to raise those cap rates. We
Interesting.
need to recognize that they have a significant contribution not only to our grid, but to our water resources, to our
Yeah.
air resources, to our wildfire suppression efforts. And we need to address that by just simply raising caps on programs that exist and allow those individuals to enter into agreements with either IOUs, POUs, DWR,
Yeah.
whoever could be a purveyor of that power,
Yeah.
and get them up and running. I mean, that's what it
Yeah.
comes down to. That is really as simple as it is. Now, I say it's simple. Nothing is simple. You've done this long enough. You know that everything's complicated, but that's the initiatives that we're working on.
It's never simple when you're dealing with the legislature, but I do love this idea of, harness the market to solve some of the biggest challenges in our state, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's what this is. This is uh, an additional step to help us, address our forest issues by harnessing, innovation in the market. And I think to me that's a no brainer. And I think for the most part, as more and more people really acknowledge the size of the problem in California, it has to be part of the solution.
Yeah, it has to be. I mean, and we talked about it, and just think about this, and then we can move on to another subject if you wish. But we talk about this issue in the context of like we are treating green forest and creating material.
Yeah.
We're also losing green forest at an extraordinarily fast rate. So if you want to drive resiliency in those landscapes, you need to get the material off the landscape, get them reforested, and let them start contributing back to um, our our carbon sequestration and storage in terms of working in natural lands. We have to do that.
Yeah.
You cannot do it well if you don't have outlets to get rid of all the burned material. You need to pull that out the landscape to allow for a successful reforestation effort to occur and not leave fuels out there so the next wildfire that ignites wipes out that entire investment.
Good point.
So, I mean, it is a prevention piece, but it's also a recovery piece. And we were not quick enough in the state to address the problem to support just simply prevention. We have now migrated where this is such a necessary action for just the recovery side
Yeah.
of the equation as well.
Interesting. Last question for you. What are you working on? What are some of the things you are working on in the legislature? Is there anything you want to mention on that side of things? And then we'll let you get out of here.
Well, I think I'll reflect on a couple bills from last year that I think were helpful. And these are like, this is the kind of stuff that policy wonks like myself deal with. But we worked very closely last year with Assemblyman Wood,
Mm-hmm.
and he was very helpful in making some minor adjustments to some of the permits within the Forest Practice Act
Okay.
that are going to help us as a state, not as an industry, as a state, all landowners in the state that are non-federal, drive resiliency through having a less rigorous permitting regime, but still looking at that, relying upon the conservation ethic as it relates to outcomes, right? So
Yeah.
Dr. Wood, that was something that Cal Forest spent a lot of time on. We spent time with not only ourselves, but Pacific Forest Trust and others working on that. So that was helpful.
Great.
We spent a lot of time last year advocating for Cal Fire and their suppression budget. And we're going to do that again this year. As you well know, we're in a bit of a fiscal drought, and we'll be working
Absolutely.
on that front as well. Because we can't allow, given the crisis we're facing, we can't allow to lose assets on that suppression side. And we always try to build partnerships between CAL FIRE and the U.S. Forest Service and private landowners so that we have a common language, a common goals and common objectives as it relates to
Sure.
all issues forest related, suppression, prevention, recovery, the whole 9 yards. So those are the kind of issues that we're constantly working on.
That's awesome. Now I know that Dr. Wood, Assemblymember Wood, cares about these issues, but I can't help the irony of Assemblymember Wood working on issues to deal with our forests. I just think that it's funny that is the legislator, his name, that you got him of all people to work on this issue. I mean, that's pretty hilarious.
It was interesting when I and I certainly don't want to speak on behalf of Assemblymember Wood at all, and I was not in my position when he assumed his role within the assembly, but his district does go all the way up to Humboldt County, Sonoma County, Delaware County. So he was immersed in these issues and he learned about them. And it appears that he developed some kind of passion. He comes from healthcare, dentistry, right? An amazing gentleman, by the way, for anybody who's never met him, an amazing gentleman. But he developed a passion for this, and so he was willing to take on this initiative. It is a little odd that his last name is Wood, and we're talking about the forest product sector.
But it's a good branding issue.
I didn't even think about honestly. I didn't even think about it until right now.
It just occurred to me as we're having this conversation. I don't think I've ever thought about that before, but it was pretty funny. Any final thoughts before we get you out of here?
My final thought is I just really appreciate the audience, I suppose. Right?
Yeah, I appreciate it.
This is one of my first times doing a podcast, so I'm interested to see how it turns out. But I appreciate the invite and happy to come back anytime.
Sure.
And I look forward to seeing you around Sacramento.
Likewise. And really appreciate you coming on. And I really do think that this is such an important issue and want to get more information out there on it and just more education out there on it. Hopefully, I think a lot of things you said are going to be really helpful in doing that. So we'll definitely try to spread this one out there. If you want to share ideas for future shows, you can email pointoforderpod@gmail.com. You can listen on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Watch, subscribe, or follow on YouTube, X, Instagram, Threads, and Facebook at Point of Order Pod. And you can follow me on X at Joshua_Hoover. Is there any particular place I should send folks to learn more about Cal Forest?
Well, it's a great question. So we just revamped our website, calforest.org.
Awesome.
Yeah, so you could visit there, learn more about the association, learn more about the organization, find my contact information. If you got questions, feel free to call me, email.
Love it. Well, I'll definitely read it. We'll also put that link in our show notes for anyone that's interested. But Matt, thanks so much for joining us today. And we'll see you next time.
Yeah, thank you.
See you later.